So thank you again, Minister Tang, for joining us. It's an honor to have a chance to talk with you. We've admired your leadership on digital issues, your concerns for equity, and your optimism about the use of technology and your effort to make technology more human. So really, it's a privilege to listen and learn from you. With us, joining me in this conversation is my colleague Kyoko Yoshinaga.
Hello. Listen.
Kyoko is currently in Tokyo and shows the far reach of Georgetown, and so, but she's actually soon to relocate back to DC. So Kyoko and Prince Albert is a former student of mine, I'm very happy to say, and has stayed after graduation as a fellow at the Tech Institute. He's a junior fellow where Kyoko is a senior fellow. And Nikolas Guggenberger, who is the executive director of the Yale Information Society Project. Nick you're in New Haven, right, Nick?
Physically in Boston, but working in New Haven.
Okay, right. You're physically in Boston. So thank you again for taking this time. And so, Minister Tang, you are part of this conversation that we're hosting, where we're going to talk with a lot of people across the world on issues of AI governance. So that's the kind of focal point. And we're going to examine these issues from a perspective of municipalities, nation states, issues with respect to internal corporate governance and AI, and of course, international. And that last piece, the kind of learning from our sister countries across the world, is of course one of the reasons we reached out to you. And so let me begin with my first question. You have called for reconceptualizing AI as assistive intelligence. What do you mean by that? And as digital minister for Taiwan, how have you sought to bring this vision to your country?
So yes, thank you. Very good question. When Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, our president, became president in 2016 for the first term, she said, and I quote, "We think of democracy before as showdown between two opposing values, but now democracy must become a conversation between many diverse values." And I think a very similar outlook when we look at AI is at stake here. Whether we look at it as something that's as opposed to human work, for example, or whether it's something that helps facilitating human to work together better. Democracy, to me, is a type of technology, and the old way of aggregating preferences, like 3 bits per person per 4 years, which is called voting, by the way, leaves many people feel disempowered by the bit rate of democracy. And in Taiwan, we use AI to assist listening at scale to build pro-social digital public infrastructure, such as Polis, to solve emerging problems, such as the one posed by UberX in 2015, where people resonate with one another's ideas without attacking each other, simply by using K-means clustering to find people's common preferences, principal component analysis to show people what's at stake, what's the main issues at hand, and then highlighting the rough consensus around insurance, around registration, not undercutting existing meters, and so on, which then we used to make new laws around multi-purpose taxi. So it shows that with the collective intelligence of people, the AI can assist this collective intelligence, so it scales better than a face-to-face facilitation, which may max out at around 150 people. Dunbar's number, AI has no Dunbar's number.
So that is a wonderful example of living this and bringing it to a country. So can you tell us a little bit about what you think of the role of the private sector versus the government in all this? What is the role of civil society in this conversation and the use of and the governance of AI in this process?
Yes, I believe in the people-public-private partnerships that starts with the social sector, people who voluntarily contribute to data and to the media narratives. So in Taiwan, we no longer teach media and data literacy at school. We teach media and data competence, meaning that each school children is a data steward, is a data and media producer who can fact check the 3 presidential candidates during debate, who can set up air measurement boxes that writes via NB-IoT or LoRa into a distributed ledger that senses PM 2.5 and senses the general climate along with the entire country, indeed the world, and learn the importance of data quality, collaboration in a coalition setting. And with this strong social sector understanding the ramifications of data bias and so on, the public sector scales out their conversations so that it's not just about one county or one township, but about the entire nation. This necessitates public investment to public infrastructure, such as our high performance computing cluster that any primary school or high schooler can just get a very large amount of GPU time to do their AI projects. And the public sector, after ensuring this democratized access, can then work with the private sector on the norm already agreed by the social sector and the public sector. So the private sector may, of course, make a good business out of the data economy, but always in a way that does not cause either short-term or long-term social harm.
Thank you for that amazing vision. I wanted to invite my colleague, Nick, to ask the next question.
Thank you for that, and a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Tang. I want to build on what you have just discussed. Over the past years, we have learned that algorithmic decision-making can, certain instances, lead to bias and exacerbate discrimination against certain groups and even hide bias behind supposedly neutral algorithms. Now, in practice, that can mean excessive policing in certain communities, that can mean unfair sentencing, or it can mean inequitable distribution of public benefits. How do you think about addressing these concerns?
I would first say that the code is easier to change than what's bias in people's heads sometimes. So surfacing those bias in the code may not be a bad thing if we do have a feedback mechanism that can correct those code very quickly. For example, in Taiwan, in February 2020, we started mask rationing out of the 6,000 pharmacies, and each and every citizen can use their phone to check the real-time open API that we publish as soon as we collect every 30 seconds the real-time stock availability of medical grade mask. So when they queue in line, they can see their phone and check the person queuing before them, actually swipe the national IC health card and purchased 2 or 3 or 10 medical masks. And so because of that, at the beginning, we saw the map overlapping the map of mask availability with population centers. It's almost a perfect match. So we feel very happy, like this is equitable distribution of mask. But just a couple of weeks later, a member of the parliament, MP Gao Hong'an, previously VP of data analytics at Foxconn, so she knows something about data, did an interpellation to the Minister of Health saying, actually, according to the OpenStreetMap community, the time opportunity cost that rural people have to take to the nearby pharmacy is actually many times compared to the urban places. The map shows only the distance of helicopters, but it actually doesn't measure the bus and the public transportation schedule. So there is a bias here. Now imagine if we publish the statistics if only every quarter. There is no way the OpenStreetMap community can work with MP Gao Hong'an on such a real-time analysis. But because we publish in real time in Open API, Minister Chen responded to this evidence-based interpellation saying, legislator, teach us. And she and the OpenStreetMap community co-created a new distribution strategy, even including the pre-ordering just a day afterward. So we wrote a new strategy out 24 hours after she did the interpolation. So with a strong feedback mechanism, I would say that unveiling these biases may not be a bad thing, but this requires an absolute transparency in the source of the data, as well as accountability of the governance with the people on the co-governing relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And with transparency, you've already mentioned the crucial point there. Most of the AI applications are run by private corporations, not directly the government, even if they're employed by the state, at least in many jurisdictions. How do you think we should ensure democratic control over AI if these algorithms are run by private corporations, oftentimes shielded by trade secrets?
Well, the Polis application that I mentioned that is part of our democratic process, polis.gov.tw now, is entirely free software. It's invented in Seattle, that's correct, but there is no patent or trade secret. It's maintained by the free software community, and we run our own cybersecurity penetration testing. It's hosted on a National Center of High-Speed Computation. The entire stack is free software and audited by pretty much any civil society organizations that cares about the democratic process, who can always fork the conversation, downloading all the data and set up a new Polis conversation. And they often do with the help from the civic-minded media people. And so my point is that unless it's free software, unless it's hosted in a way that allows public audit, there really could be no way, algorithmically speaking, to ensure there's no backdoors on the cybersecurity sense or backdoors on a privacy and bias sense. So I insist that any part of democratic process that's assisted by AIs need not to only be explainable, but actually forkable, able to be taken to different directions, because after all, that's how open innovations work.
Wonderful. And with that, I'll give it over to Kyoko.
Yes. Hello, it's such an honor to have you with us. What would you like to see in terms of international cooperation or international governance frameworks on AI? Where do you think it will be most beneficial for governments to work together on AI? And if there's any, what can we learn from existing internet governance?
Certainly. I think one of the fruitful areas is to set the norms around AI. Internet governance, after all, is all about making norms, especially on the core parts of the internet, to make sure that the existing players do not foreclose possibilities by future players. That's the permissionless innovation, end-to-end principle. The core internet principles are about this generation not making progress at the expense to the innovations made by next generations, because almost by default, we understand the next generation are going to be better than us doing the decisions, at least concerning the future generations. So because of that, this stakeholder horizon is very long-term. And education, the idea of digital competence, the competence of framing this media conversation as people who are understanding the media process and make their own media rather than just consuming the media and so on. I think this is also very important. So the wide accessibility to AI tools for especially school children, but also lifelong learning, and an international norm about using AI in a way that's assistive to the collective intelligence, not the other way around. These are the two main norms that I would like to advocate and see happen.
Thank you very much.
And Nick, it's back to you.
Yes, thank you. And we're going to stay on the global stage. What do you think that other countries can learn from Taiwan in how it approaches AI?
I think Taiwan is a living example that it's possible to fight the pandemic with no lockdown, fight the infodemic with no takedown, thanks to the digital public infrastructure. in 2016, along with the Minister of Culture, Zheng Lijun at the time, we made a compelling argument to the National Budgeting Office that public infrastructure on the digital sphere, even though there's really nothing tangible, is still public infrastructure and warrants the investment of the kind that the state allocates to build bridges or dams or things like that. And this is essential because without this public investment, we would be forced to use private sector built infrastructure on the process of democracy and deliberation. It would be like on the more antisocial corners of certain social media. It would be like deliberating with a private bouncer in a nightlife district selling addictive drinks and so on, not at all conductive to a civic-minded conversation. Of course, there are places for the nightlife district and so on for that, but we should not build democracy based on these private sector entities that were not designed for democracy and civic discourse. So I would like to spread the idea of digital public infrastructure and point to the Taiwanese example. For example, the PTT, the Taiwanese equivalent of Reddit, is around for 25 years, more than many companies in AI, and it still stays a national Taiwan University student pet project that doesn't answer to advertisers or shareholders, and such structures are possible if the governments are willing to invest to it, just like we invest in the public parks, the public libraries, and universities.
Thank you very much. We'll definitely incorporate the call for public infrastructure in our benchmarking. Now, you have spent time in Silicon Valley, in Europe, and all over the world. What is it that you have learned from other countries, what you have brought back to Taiwan?
One is the idea of failing spectacularly and in an open fashion that benefits the ecosystem, the fail fast culture. This is very important, especially when you're trying out things. Nobody can guarantee success on the first try, but it's important not just on the academic rigor or intellectual honesty sense, but actually it makes sense to share how you fail. So other people may actually see unforeseen applications in other fields in a cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary learning that forms the core of many free software and open source projects. It didn't work on this market, but actually work pretty well as a foundational component in some other markets. So that's what I learned mostly working with the open source communities. And that's why we now advocate in our, for example, undergraduate studies, students could start new ideas as social entrepreneurs, but if they fail spectacularly, the national education budget pays for it and also pays for the crowdfunding help. And then they can write up their pivoting experience as a paper or as their capstone project. That really helps to explore the pro-social uses of AI because the students always think about pro-social ways, but they may not have the investment, the capital to try out large-scale things unless the community specifically encourage it.
Thank you very much. And with that, back to Kyoko.
Some people have warned about the possibility of AI gaining control over humans in the future. While that may seem a distant future, even today AI is replacing ordinary decision makers. In your work, you have said that instead of seeking a singularity, you would like us to recognize a plurality. Could you explain what you mean by this?
Certainly. To me, singularity is what happens if one only take one measurement of success. It could be, fulfilling some utility function. It could be the linear GDP or whatever. And then just over optimizing on that to the expense to everything else. Now, plurality means that in a democratic society, it's natural that people use AI for various different uses. But as long as it's for the common good, as long as it makes long sense in the long horizon, like to 7 generations down the line, then everything should be encouraged. I often like to say that the Internet of Things is just an instrument to make an Internet of beings. And by beings, I mean the nature, the next generations, animals, rivers, mountains, and so on. They can actually get a voice and get a seat at the table, like in New Zealand, where they have natural personhood through the applicable ideas of AI, but this intelligence is not limited to human intelligence. And if we think about those plural values and so on, we will not be captured by the short-term over-optimization thinking that would trap us into the vision of singularity.
How should governments encourage beneficial AI and discourage more dangerous or irresponsible AI?
I often think of AI, which is essentially batch processing of cognitive functions, like fire, which is essentially batch processing of digestive functions. And fire, as you know, are also very dangerous. Their entire cities that's destroyed by fire. But what we didn't do as a civilization is that we didn't restrict fire use to just 5 licensed fire persons in the entire country. Rather, we teach fire use to 5 years old. It's called cooking classes. And we make sure that they learn about the safety and the hazard. And we make sure that when we design the infrastructure, the buildings and so on, they come with the fire hazard planning, the resilience against fire hazards and so on. So whatever we did with fire, we need to do with AI, and then we can encourage the 5 years old starting sharing their recipes.
Thank you very much.
That last answer, I'm certain, resonated perfectly with Kyoko, who actually has a 5-year-old. And I'm sure he's learned all about fire, and he's probably soon to learn all about AI. So I'm very pleased to hear about that answer. Thank you, Minister Tang, for this wonderful opportunity and these inspiring words. And I hope that that your words live through the 7 generations and guide us into the future. So
thank you for the very good questions. Live long and prosper, everyone.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. So Nick, Kyoko, and Prince, I'm sure that you were as inspired by Minister Tang as I was. Her remarks were extraordinary, just a kind of a vision of inclusive technology that is designed to not push the government's vision beyond educating the young people, 5-year-olds like Yoko's cute son, and also really kind of pushing a vision of kind of equal access and where everyone's participation is valued. I love the concept of a bit rate for democracy. The democracy has a very limited bit rate that it only changes, that we only change governments roughly every 4 years, and that we should be able to participate through tools that can, because of the numbers involved, involve AI to help kind of formulate what might be, as Minister Tang described, a rough consensus. Rough consensus is, of course, an old IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, description of the process by which the Internet protocol has been democratically, in some sense, created and modified and evolved over the last few decades, and so it was an extraordinary opportunity for me to listen to Minister Tang directly and have the opportunity to speak with her. Let me say that I myself also experienced Taiwan's amazing kind of success, I mean, relative to everywhere else, with respect to the pandemic that we're still faced with, and many of the countries in the world are still grappling with terribly. And so I was in Taiwan on March 8th. I stepped out of the cab and I asked someone for directions. And the gentleman reached into his car first thing, and he grabbed a mask and gave it to me. And so the government and civil society had mobilized by the beginning of March such that masks were ubiquitous in the country, that they could be shared with strangers. And this was on the street, everyone was wearing a mask. And the country understood how to respond to this, whatever information, disinformation that Taiwan has faced, and campaigns of disinformation, et cetera. They were able to understand immediately how to respond to this crisis and do so incredibly successfully, even though they were near the epicenter of the crisis and they are enormous population on a very small island. And so it demonstrated, just the ability of a country to use technology to democratize access to PPP, to make sure, and to obviously good governance. It wasn't all technology; it was also just old-fashioned good governance to ensure that everyone had the protection they needed to, and without, as Minister Tang pointed out, they survived the pandemic without a lockdown. They survived the infodemic without takedowns, as she argued. And this is through Taiwan had a very aggressive fact-checking operation over the last few years. And so they had an election in January 2020, and I think they have seemed to be kind of quite advanced in learning how to correct disinformation, even though they are, of course, in a kind of political whirlwind where they are subject to it. So it was a very nice opportunity to learn for me.